All right, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Chris Neidl with the OpenAir Collective, and I'm happy to bring you another episode of 20-something Minutes with. Today, I'm going to be talking with Anirudh Dinesh, who's a senior research fellow at the New York University Governance Lab. Ani has already been a really useful resource and participant in some of our thinking at OpenAir about how we can develop our own methodology to, really tap the resources of the crowd to support direct air capture, particularly in the policy space. So Ani, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Great. And as we do on these calls, we want to dive into really specific kind of nuts and bolts issues that relate to some of the problems that we're trying to solve as a community. So one thing I'm going to do, I think, just to sort of set this up for both you and the audience, I'm just going to share a couple slides real quick, just to give kind of an overview of the way that we're thinking about it here at OpenAir. Is that we're looking at where can we have the most impact at different points of what we call the policy realization life cycle. We want to develop policies that are going to help advance direct air carbon capture at the local, state, and federal level. And so we see our sort of main key areas of intervention are the development of policy ideas, the actual creation of those policies in terms of their documents, and then advocating for them in the real world. And so to break those down a little bit further, when we think of ideation, we think of how can we make sure that the policies that we're conceiving have input from a larger universe of people that have the expertise that are going to make those good policies. And some of the key questions we have there are, what type of crowd are we talking about there in order to really have that be an effective exercise? And what are the kinds of policies, I guess, that are the most appropriate to sort of use a crowd for? And then the creation is literally, how do we actually collaboratively, in very practical terms, develop those policies, the language of those policies, the body, the substance of those policies in a way that utilizes the expertise or the resources of the crowd. And then finally, we're not going to be talking about this so much today, but we're interested in, at OpenAir, how we can use crowd-based methods to basically build, recruit, and mobilize individuals and groups around the countries in different areas that can take the policies that we developed and run with them and try to get them implemented in local areas while still staying connected to our community. So what I think we'll talk about today, Ani, real quick, is I'd like to really get into, and you've already mentioned to me offline, there's kind of another step here that even sort of precedes what I've kind of put in the life cycle, but I'd like to really get down to brass tacks on the ideation and creation parts here. And you can share with us, when do you use a crowd? What can a crowd really sort of offer for these processes? What are some tools that we could potentially look to develop our own method? And what are maybe some examples from around the world that'll be useful for us to sort of look to or potentially model ourselves after? So, and we're going to go ahead and start here. If we can get into it, I guess. First of all, I guess, Ani, I think that you've talked about there's sort of another step that I'm missing maybe before ideation that we should probably consider.
Right. Thanks, Chris. That's a very useful introduction just to set the stage. The step before the ideation, I think, is problem definition, which is a really critical step in any innovative project, not just a crowd-based project. Problem definition really helps identify who is the right target audience that you should aim your solution at, but also who you should involve in the process as you develop that solution. And that's the one piece that I would add to the policymaking cycle that you defined. And we have at the GovLab created a similar sort of framework for our CrowdLaw project, which is a participatory policymaking project that we've started now about 5 or 6 years ago. And that starts with problem identification and sort of setting the agenda for what are the kind of problems that people are interested in. The reason I brought that up earlier offline when we were discussing this was because one critical piece of any sort of participatory project is understanding who you need to reach out to, both so that you can get the most useful and kind of actionable feedback from that crowd, but also to make it a process that you can manage well and kind of offer the right incentives to the right people in order to retain that crowd.
Gotcha. And for that part of it, so I'm just curious if there are tools or methods generically that you could point to that we could potentially use, given the space that we're operating in, to start thinking about who do we want to get at the table and how do we sort of extract those problem ideas basically from them.
Right. So there's two levels of this, I think, from my perspective. One is there's a stage of this, which is to identify what are there specific areas beyond just kind of the larger DACC initiative, um, specific things that you're trying to break down and kind of find policy solutions or regulations or whatever it is that isn't too broad, that you're not able to identify an audience, right? So sort of breaking that down into smaller pieces of, there's some financial issues, there's some policy issues, there's some technological issues, and identifying those different pieces is the first step, I think, to finding the right folks to reach out to at the right time. And then there's also a piece of this, which is there's certain places where you want a limited crowd. You want to reach out to the experts in a certain field to identify exactly what the right technology solutions are, for instance. And so in those situations, you want to kind of limit how much outreach you're doing to a certain specific crowd.
And is there sort of an exercise or a helpful way that we can sort of think through that when we want to say, well, who do we want, whose perspective do we want brought to bear on this particular subject, so that we can sort of identify the problems?
Absolutely. So this is, and I think this is why I mentioned that problem definition, doing that problem definition exercise up front can help, so that you're not too far down a rabbit hole and having to change a lot of things as you discover things later on. I can share these links with you. So we've created this public problem solving canvas at the GovLab, which helps you sort of think through right from what is the problem we're tackling, who are most likely, the people affected by this issue, who should I go speak with first to identify other folks who might have to be involved in this project, who are likely to be my support system, who's likely to be opposed to this idea. It's a set of questions that you can answer, and it's a kind of living, breathing document that changes over time as you discover more about it as you go through with the project. But it's just a framework to help you think through some of these issues. And I can share that link with you. It's just an online tool, free for anyone to use.
Great, I'll add that. Okay, so that's helpful. So I guess let's just say that we get to a phase where we identify the sort of the universe of problems. So does the idea of ideating around trying to converge on more concrete policy ideas flow directly from that methodologically?
Yeah, absolutely. So that then brings us to sort of the first stage in the process that you defined of ideation. And there's plenty of examples of both methods and tools of how you can involve the crowd in the ideation process. Part of this is familiar to a lot of people about, online petitions using change.org and things like that, where people often propose a change in a law or a new law or some new project, and get signatures for it to show support for a certain idea. And I think that's pretty common. And you'll see change.org is a very successful website, hundreds of thousands of petitions on there. And that's one way of engaging the crowd, which is someone has a great idea and they're trying to go and get support for their ideas from other folks. The other way to do it is kind of what is happening now in many governments around the world are using open innovation as a way of identifying solutions to public problems. There's several open source platforms. One of them that comes to mind is called Consul, and it's being used in I think about 130 institutions around the world, countries around the world, for this kind of open innovation ideation process. One other example that I'll just mention is called Your Priorities, which is an Iceland-based open innovation platform again, where it works in a very similar way, where you pose a problem to the public and then have them suggest ideas on the platform, and they have a commenting system where other people can comment either in support or against someone else's idea, and you're able to see both the pros and cons of that idea before you make a decision about, do I really want to support this or not? So there's design mechanisms that help like this, that help make it easier to gather the feedback. The other approach to it is sort of what we did with the Smarter Crowdsourcing project at the GovLab, where the problems we defined were more narrow than that. It's so we, for instance, just to give a brief background on the Smarter Crowdsourcing project, we worked with the Inter-American Development Bank and about 5 Latin American governments to identify solutions or mitigation methods for the Zika crisis, about 3 years ago now. And in that project, rather than saying we want to come up with a vaccine for Zika, which we don't have the capacity to do, so there's no real solution to the Zika virus, we broke down that problem into about 15 different specific problem areas. There's an information and awareness problem. There is a long-term care problem for how do you protect pregnant women. How do you do some sort of predictive analytics and understand where future outbreaks might be. These are all tiny problems that contribute towards the larger kind of Zika epidemic. And breaking that down into those sort of very specific subject matter areas helped us bring in diverse experts as part of the larger conversation, but they were all focused on a very specific subject matter that they're experts in. And so both of these approaches, I think, setting a very large, lofty challenge versus setting very narrow, specific targets are both, I think, approaches that can be taken. And honestly, you could try both, really.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for that, so I guess what we could do is, because I know Smarter Crowdsourcing, just to describe it for our audience of how it works, because we know there are other areas of our work where it could be potentially applied that you and I have discussed so far. Could you just sort of sketch out a little bit how that method works that was developed at the GovLab? Because I think, again, it could be something we might want to modify or use ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So Smarter Crowdsourcing is a six-step process that starts with this problem definition, which we now discussed a little bit, and then identify about 20 or 25 experts in that specific domain for each of those problems, and bring them together in an online conference where we brainstorm ideas to solve that problem. Once those ideas come out in that 2-hour conference, we then have a team internally who goes back and does more research on how much does it cost for each of these solutions, what is the timeline for implementation, and makes a set of actionable recommendations that the institutions who need to implement these can actually use. So this includes cost, timelines, contact people, additional research, resources for links to see where it's been done previously. So these aren't just ideas that are hypothetical. These are things that have already been done somewhere, and we've spoken to the folks who've done it, and bringing their expertise to bear, so that institutions can then learn from what's already happened, what's come before. So that's the output of Smarter Crowdsourcing is a set of actionable recommendations. The input is a set of problems that need to be tackled to sort of mitigate a larger ratio.
So you have the set of problems. You have then these curated webinars that occur over a period of time with different groups of experts that you've brought in. And I'd love to get a kind of an inside sense of what that is like. What's the actual internal method of those workshops, so that you get those initial other ideas that come out. Then there's staff that reviews those and refines those into specific recommendations. So I guess two things, because as you can tell, because we've talked about this before, I'm very interested in some modification of this format. I think could be plugged in many areas of our work. How you use the experts, what that looks like, those 2-hour online things. And then if you could just give us an example of what those recommendations are, even just taking from the Zika, how specific do those sort of get? What are they like? I'd love to hear that, if you don't mind.
Sure. So the webinars are 2 hours long. We did 6 of them over the course of 2 weeks. And they had about 20 or 25 people at most. So in total, we brought together about 100 or 120 experts, mainly because beyond 20 people, it becomes hard to manage an online format, to moderate a conversation within 2 hours. Going into the webinar, we create these problem briefs, which are the problem descriptions that we came up with based on the problem definitions that we'd written, and then a series of questions that we wanted answered by these experts. And it's a conversation that's moderated based on that set of questions that we share with the participants, that are catered towards their expertise, to what they've done before. Just hearing from these experts on all the projects that they've worked on that could answer that question, and then getting some feedback from the others about, oh yeah, this could work in this context. No, this is the reason this might not work in this context. So getting some of that debate going within the group. And it's very
Let me
tightly
ask you just a
scheduled.
quick question, just to go to it.
Sure.
So is this a case where each of the experts gets a certain amount of time to say it, or there's a moderator that's raising a question and it's sort of voluntary self-selection? Or I'm just curious how you actually really wring out the expertise.
It's a very tightly moderated session. So everybody gets one round to do a brief introduction on the project that they've worked on.
Okay.
And then we sort of open it up to these set of 4 or 5 questions that we have for the larger group, and then start getting inputs from everybody. And it has to be very, very tightly moderated. Otherwise, the conversation really goes out and becomes hard to gather anything from that, from the conversation. So we had a team, apart from the experts who were online and GovLab's director, Beth Novak, who was moderating the conversation. We had a team of 3 or 4 research assistants taking notes, sharing links in the chat, dealing with sort of technical issues that might come up with. We did it on Zoom, so we need some people working on just resolving technical issues. So that's the mechanics of how that worked. As far as solutions go, we spoke, for example, I guess one of the examples that I can mention is predictive analytics. We had worked with a professor, data analytics professor, who had worked on creating a forecasting mechanism for dengue predictions in Pakistan.
Dengue.
And dengue, in Pakistan, based on hotline calls. So there was a dengue hotline in Pakistan when the outbreak happened, and kind of he was drawing correlations between spikes in the hotline calls to actual outbreaks in dengue, and how can we leverage that in the Zika context. And so the recommendations were specific to, he had already done this before. So what did it cost him? What does it cost to set up a call center of that kind? What does it cost to do the analysis? What kind of tools do you use? Things like that. So that's one example that I can point to. But all of this, including the problem briefs that were sent to the participants ahead of time, everything's online on the website, and I can share the link to the website.
Yeah, that would be incredibly useful to take a look at. So we are at a phase right now where we already are looking to bring in other people to give us direct input in the writing of legislation and the improvement of legislation. And if you could tell us a little bit about some methods that can be used to kind of put together certain crowds to be involved in that kind of process that leads to better outcomes, I would love to hear about them and specific examples.
Yeah, sure. So there's, again, 2 ways of doing this, right? One is you already have a draft that you want people to review and share comments on. And you could use very basic tools like Google Docs, for instance, where you put up the draft and then you have people commenting. There's also slightly more advanced tools that you could use, like Hypothesis, which is an online annotation tool, which it's just a plugin into your browser, into your web page. It adds a layer on top of the screen, and you can basically annotate any website or any PDF that you put online.
We're using that now based on your
really neat feature.
We're using that now based on your recommendation. So far,
so great. Yeah, so Hypothesis is great. It lets you do things like you can have it share the link where anybody in the public can comment, and you can export all those comments. But also, if you want to share the link only with a specific subset of experts or someone else, you can create private groups so you limit the number of comments coming in. So this kind of commenting on drafts is one approach that you can take. The other approach is actually getting people to contribute to the process of writing legislation. And so the example that I'll take for this is in Brazil. They have a platform called Wikilegis, which is a collaborative drafting platform where people can go in and add in their own kind of language. But there are these tools where you can actually collaborate. There's a very popular example of collaborative drafting, which is Wikipedia. Wikipedia, of course, is crowdsourced in some sense. There's a very strict process for approving comments and things, or suggestions, things like that. And that process works pretty well, honestly. And you could use Wikimedia, which is what Wikipedia is based on, to create tiny wikis for these policies and in order to have collaborative drafting. So that's one other example.
Great. Yeah, I've looked at Wikilegis a little bit. It's trying to figure it out literally in the last couple of days, and maybe I'll reach out to some folks there and see if they can even give a bit of a tutorial, because that sounds, or again, just Wikimedia might even work, and then we can have someone else convert it into actual bill language. But
yeah.
In
fact, after our conversation about GitHub, I found this really nice repository that came out of the previous Whitehouse for their open government partnership. They had set up a really nice repository of all their open government tools and methods and definitions and everything. And it's open to the public to suggest new tools that they've come across or new definitions, whatever you want to add in. It's based on GitHub. And you make a pull request, you add in your suggestion, and then someone approves it, and then it goes live on the website.
Interesting. Is that actually a GitHub it's not part of GitHub, but they more or less modeled it after that in terms of the similar functionality, but just for?
No, it actually uses GitHub. So the front-facing website looks really nice and pretty, but it's all powered by a set of markdown pages, which you can go in and edit on GitHub. You create a GitHub account, you log in, you make a pull request, and then you make the edits. So it's powered using the actual GitHub.
Okay, great. Send me the link for that, and I'll share it here.
Yeah.
And then just one last thing to end on, which you mentioned a little bit too, about when you go through these exercises, particularly if you're doing it in the same subject area, you start to develop this persistent network of community of people that want to participate or that you can draw on in the future. And that's less of a methodology. Well, I guess it's a methodology question, but I'm wondering if you have any sort of guidance on what's the best way to build those communities and to retain them, I guess. What are the incentives like for people to stay involved and participate? Is there any part of the literature that you can sort of summarize for us regarding that?
Yeah, so what we've come across and this is more from the CrowdLaw work that we've done, is the intrinsic incentives and the external incentives that people have. So intrinsically, there are some people who are motivated to participate in the process simply because their voice is being heard, or my suggestion is being implemented to solve this problem, and so there's a sort of motivation that comes just from being part of the process. And in some cases, that actually works better than the extrinsic incentives, which is like we mentioned earlier about price pack challenges, where there's a financial incentive, or there's an incentive like you get to meet the mayor if this gets implemented, or you get a signed certificate from the president, or whatever it is, right? Yeah. And in some cases, intrinsic motivations are actually kind of more powerful than extrinsic motivation. Also, because those are the people who are kind of self-selecting and coming into it with the motivation that I really want to make a change. So yeah. I'm not doing this just for the prize. I'm doing it because it solves a problem. So those communities, you've probably seen this in the citizen science community, is a lot of really people who are really invested in the process because they want to see it grow and see it successful. So those are the two incentives that we've sort of seen so far.
Yeah. So what I'd like to do, I think we're at our 20-something minutes cap here. I got exactly what I wanted out of this, which was we need some fodder. We've already developed a little bit of a methodology, Google Docs, putting together. We have some success in the real world, but we want to keep refining this. And you've pointed us in a lot of directions here today that are going to help us kind of take that next step. I am going to ask you, if you don't mind me inviting you on this one, if we could have you back in maybe a month or so when we've sort of baked this a little bit more together. And I'd love to present it to you, and you can sort of poke some holes at it and, possibly give us some, additional guidance and direction, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I'd be delighted.
Okay. Awesome. Ani, thank you so much for joining us today. This was great.
Thank you, Chris. It was great fun.
Yep. See ya.